Hello, thanks for having me. Every time I come to Wales, I feel so English, it's awful. So just have to deal with that, I'm afraid, as am I. But it's good to be here, as always. I've never been here when the sun is shining, so it is an absolute first for me. So I must just come in the winter, obviously. Tonight I'm going to be talking about some of the work that we're doing. There was definitely a bit of a theme in that. Who's been invited, which I hadn't realised, which is essentially anyone Nesta invests in. So we've previously been invested in by Nesta, so we're part of their family in some ways. We're also invested in by Surrey County Council, so we could talk about what it's like to have a bit of government as a shareholder of a company that's trying to do innovation in government, which seems like something that might be relevant to the subject tonight as well, if we want to talk about that later. But that's kind of a side topic. What I'm mostly going to be talking about is some of the work that we've been doing around designing public services for the digital age. That's like our tagline and what I talk about incessantly, and I think it's I don't move away from it very much because I think it quite neatly captures the framing in terms of how we think about the work that needs to be done right now in terms of trying to get government into the 21st century, just like any other large enterprise in any sector. How do they actually take the sort of good of government, the sort of democratic legitimacy, the connection to community, the reliability of delivering public services, but how do you actually then jettison the really arduous heavyweight institutions that sit behind all of that and actually bring it into the 21st century and use digital as a means by which we scale a very human-centered design approach to public services. We had just turned 10 as an organisation, which blows my mind a little bit, to be honest. My background was in local government before I set up FutureGov. Don't feel like I've left government much over that period. We've worked with about 70 or 80 different bits of government in different parts of the world. The thing that stayed pretty consistent over that time actually is our Venn diagram around, well, except for it kind of used to be design, tech and change, with the sort of three parts of our approach, which morphed into three different types of design, both service design, which is around how do you really ensure user centricity, how do you ensure that you bring real insight from data and conversation with people who are using public services and working for public services so that you can actually start to think about the way services could and should be. And then how do you similarly think about the local context of any given organisation? What is the budgetary constraints? What is the politics? What is the processes that they're dealing with? And it's that point of friction between those two things that ultimately will become the design solution for a 21st century government. There is not much point in designing services that are in essentially, if you're focused on institutional reform like I am, rather than social innovation where you have the luxury of sort of, let's do this as if government doesn't exist and institutions don't exist and how we would do it from scratch. If you're thinking about institutional reform, it is about thinking about those design constraints on both sides. Interestingly, when you work with government, people will quite often say, well, we can't really listen too much to what people want because they're unreasonable. They want the world on a stick and it'll cost the earth. And that has never been true in the work that I've seen. Actually, policy wonks are the best at inventing really expensive top-down solutions that nobody wants to use. And actually, when you start talking to citizens, you realise they want something very simple and cheap to get something done. And so it is actually brilliant when it comes to better services being cheaper services. And then product design is where we talk about technology design as well. And essentially that aspect is around how do you then knit it all together as a solution and scale it, because digital technology is the most powerful tool that we currently have in terms of scaling our institutions in a much lower cost way and a more effective way. And for us, you can't really disentangle any of those three methodologies, any of those three approaches, because if you do, you sort of pull one leg of the stool out and you miss out on opportunities that you might find. Where they all sort of mutually reinforce each other and give quite a different mindset and a very 21st century feel to things. Like we've worked all over the world. We've got an office in Australia and we seem to work on the flight path between here and there. But we have a partnership with the UN, and the reason I talk about this is that like government is pretty much the same the world over. Like there's, more or less corruption, there's more or less democracy, but ultimately, like it has quite a similar rhythm and resting heartbeat. The Westminster model of government has permeated most of the world in some form or another, which is kind of helped by the UK having colonised about 192 countries over the period of the history of the earth. But ultimately, what is interesting is that methodology works in different contexts. If you're in the West, essentially what we're talking about is deconstructing our expensive monolithic institutions into something that is much more collaborative and much more porous and transparent and co-owned with community. If you're in places like Albania or Armenia or other places that we've worked, and that isn't where Albania is, those geography nerds amongst you, that is the problem. I have a geography degree and I've become a pedant about this, but my designers are more interested in colours than they are in geography sometimes. But essentially, like if you're working in places like Armenia and Albania, actually it's about how can you use these methodologies to build a bit more government? Like how do you, but in a very different way, how do you plug the gaps? There's just whole holes in public service delivery in some of these places. And so how can you think about, and I think it's quite an opportunity for places like that to jump the development curve if they choose to, and ahead of us in many ways, because we're burdened by the incumbency and the legacy of our institutions, and they don't have that if they choose. They can just build 21st century government from scratch. They have other drags like serious corruption and political inertia, which prevents them from doing that. But ultimately, it's kind of interesting to see that across the piece. Ultimately, like the mission that I've been on for the last 15 years is to just, I have a lot of love and respect for government. Like it's got a bit of a bad rap over the years, but there is a lot to say for what government brings us as a society and as a sort of foundation for a lot of pro-social stuff in countries. But for me, I think the real risk that we're facing at the moment is if we don't essentially disrupt ourselves, if we don't take the opportunity to really fundamentally rethink government, then you get people who wear red caps and say outlandish things or do horrible things to children. Like that's where that comes from, because government becomes disconnected. Government becomes a different experience. Government doesn't get seen as value for money. It's not seen as a problem-solving institution. It's seen as a managerial, self-serving institution. And for me, like what I really want to create is a sort of like movement for change where people really understand that unless we take a hold of government and disrupt it positively, then there will be forces that disrupt it negatively and we'll lose some of the benefits around democratic legitimacy and other things, which is why I get frustrated when people are quite traditional and resistant to truly rethinking things. But this stuff is like digital transformation, whatever you want to call it, like public service reform, just trying to build 21st century public services is starting to take hold. Like I put this up to say, like there is a community now of people who are brave enough to try new things. You saw it in the Lab slide earlier, but equally there is really interesting experimentation going on. We started our work quite deliberately in child protection, one because I really care about it, and FutureGov was sort of semi-spawn out of some of our technology products like Patchwork was spawned out of some of the incidents like Baby Peter and the tragedies like that. But also, if you do get to solve some of those problems using modern technology and modern techniques, then you tell me that there's a problem you can't apply it to, was our mindset. Like if this brings value to improving child protection and you can make people shift into the 21st century mindset when they're child protection social workers who are doing some of the most challenging jobs in the country, then as a waste management officer or as somebody who's running a housing service, you tell me that it doesn't apply to the public services you're responsible for. And you just can't. Like you can't. It has benefit and it has impact across everything. Love a bit of Madeleine Albright, and I think this quote kind of captures where we are in the world quite beautifully at the moment in terms of like everything's damn complex, right? Like whether it's social media and the internet more broadly and the impact that's had on the way that we communicate and relate to one another, whether it's the way that our institutions have become very dramatically unaffordable in the age of austerity, like whatever it is, we're dealing with complexity in a way that we just haven't faced, immigration, a whole range of things. But we still go about trying to solve those problems with very old-fashioned ideas. So think about your Prince 2 frameworks or your really laborious business case creation where essentially you're complicit in a lie because you know you can't guess 5 years out that if you give someone £1 million, it'll save £5 million in 5 years' time, delivered on the 23rd of May 2023. Surprisingly, you won't know that. But we all have to do it, right? Like those are the tools that CFOs and others have decided are legitimate, and those are the rules of the game. And so for me, I've become obsessed with rewiring the corporate centre of government as well, because I think that's where all the rules are set. That's ultimately where the DNA is created, whether it's the legal framework, the procurement framework, the financial framework, the way that we roll out technology, what we buy and what we do. Like that's those sort of 20th century ideas and 19th century tools are bound up in that centre. And if you can flip that, and there's, you know, it's generally got away with it because people see it as boring, right? Like nobody really wants to go to war with the business case template or the procurement process. But that stuff is driving all of our lives. The technology decisions people make, when you think about how long social workers spend in front of a computer, from our work over the years, we reckon between 60 and 70% of their week is in front of a computer filling in an awful case management system, not out with the families that they're employed to support. And so we can say these things don't matter and they're really boring, but ultimately it's driving directly how much time these people have with families to solve social problems. So for me, it's about how do we help people understand that some of the really boring work of government, where the DNA is set, is the stuff that we need to change first and foremost. These people have like the luxury of not having to care about any of this, right? Like they have like FutureGov was born in 2008, so we all opened a MacBook, spun up G Suite, used Google Docs and Dropbox, and you know we communicate via Slack. All these people do as well. It's all very lucky and luxurious, right? Because you don't have to worry about how do we switch off these things and move to new things. But at the same time, on the front end of customer experience, this is just what our expectation is these days. And this is where government needs to be thinking if it wants to disrupt itself, because it only has, frustratingly, but it's the world we live in, it has legitimacy out of being able to be comparable to these services. And if it isn't, it's not legitimate. People don't just say, oh, it's okay, I don't mind spending half an hour on a government website to do a really simple task, your government, I forgive you. They say, God damn it, why is this not as simple as getting a pizza ordered in 32 seconds? Like, they just don't understand, especially when they're coming to government to pay taxes that they're not choosing to pay. Like, to then get in the way of that process and like hold them up is really irritating. And on the internet, everybody looks the same broadly, or should, although you know when you're on a government website quite often. And so therefore they don't say, oh, you're in a town hall and therefore I bow down to you because you're the almighty government and you're all powerful and I forgive you for your arcane processes. They go, this website is less fast than this one, what's going on? So we have to catch up with that. And we're getting there, whether it's work in Australia or gov.uk or whatever else, like we're starting to spoof it, but we are only spoofing it most of the time. Like the Cool Kid Digital Brigade have done a really good job of putting lipstick on a pig, and I'm not underestimating the work that has gone into that. What they have not done is tackle the cost of government, the complexity of government, the structures of government, the mindsets and methodologies that are beyond digital and technology. And that's the stuff that we really have to get into, particularly in local government. Central government's been lucky. George Osborne gave them £1 billion to spend on gov.uk and other things, and that was just bonus cash. Like local government in the UK has lost 3-4 billion in the last 7 years, 8 years, just out of core services, let alone getting £1 billion to get its digital act together. So we haven't really got the luxury of that. And that means, for me, opportunity for fundamental restructuring and reform where they don't have that burning platform in central government. And the risk is, like, if we don't do this stuff, it will happen to us. As ever with government, it will happen in that really slow way. Like almost like one of those really slow steamrollers that's slowly rolling over your feet, and then maybe half an hour later you're crushed to death by it. Like it feels like that sometimes, right? It's not like being hit by something really fast like it is in the private sector and it's over with. Blockbuster goes down. Like in government, it's just this never-ending slow car crash where you can see you're going to be disrupted, but it doesn't feel urgent enough that you're going to do something really quick about it. But you can look up what those sort of bro-libertarian billionaires in San Francisco are doing with their cash. They're starting to get pissed off that it is really hard to get their mums and dads into care, and therefore they're just spending some of their cash spinning up digital care startups that don't have any democratic legitimacy, no checks and balances, no public service ethos. And that's fine for them, right? It's a bit like free schools or charter schools as they have over there. That's all fine. But at a society level, is that fine? When we start to atomize in that way and we just become the sort of digital dystopia, Black Mirror style, I'm not so sure about that. But people will get drawn to that. People with disposable income in particular will start to say, I don't want you to take my taxes. You haven't got the right to waste my money. I'm going to spend that money differently with these people because they can do it quicker, cheaper, better than you. And I'll stand outside of government if you're not going to move along with the way I want you to be. And therefore, we have to think about digital in government so much differently. We have to stop with this crap, with these bad suppliers giving us bad technology that's already been jettisoned 10 years ago from the private sector because they learned it doesn't work. And then they come around to the public sector and flog it to us. Digital is not about that stuff. It isn't a noun. It isn't a department. It is essentially the 21st century and the way organisations should live, breathe, feel, talk to each other, the culture they should exude. As Tom Loosemore says, who was one of the founders of Government Digital Service, he's updated this quote to talk about business models as well, which I think is actually probably above everything, thinking about business models differently and the way of working and financing government and organisations is probably the most disruptive thing of the internet era, above all else. But I'll come back to that a little bit. So then, to us, being digital is about, yes, technology, but also this user centricity, being responsive, again, not that steamroller, but something a lot faster than that. It's being able to say, let's do something quickly, cheaply, and easily, something that we can copy and paste from a similar situation or context. Working in a much more open and networked way. I'm currently, I'll come on to in a bit, half in central government at the moment, and I'm starting to see some of the challenges which are fundamentally different to local government. People used to say to me, God, politicians get in the way all the time and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, yeah, of course they do a bit, but so do officers, quite a lot as well. But what I'm seeing in central government is the challenge of openness. When the department I'm in, the data it can publish can move markets and crash markets. It can make companies and break companies in the housing sector. And so there's definitely some nuance and thought in all of this about how we appropriately do this stuff, rather than just blindly, again, going down cool kids digital corner and saying, stick all the data out there, let's talk in the open, et cetera, because it isn't quite that simple, although those principles should still be true. I tend, as an ex-govie, I tend to not like consultancy frameworks. They tend to make me vomit. So I've tended to stay away from 2x2 matrices and other things. Having said that, people we've worked with said, this is all well and good, Dom, but what does good look like for us, not for Tesla? They've got it easy. How do you actually help us move through a journey? So we've sort of created this maturity model. There's others around. You can look at all of them. But for me, it's a way for us to start helping people move through this. It isn't really, we're going to shift it as well, because it isn't really like you're progressing to some sort of digital utopia, really. It's more like, how do you use a framework to make decisions about the services you run and effectively decide where your investment goes and how you're going to change what business model. If you're deciding that you're going to switch off a service in a year's time because it's non-statutory and you can't afford it anymore, then it's fine to say it's paper-based and it's going to stay that way until we switch it off, because why would you invest in it? If you say child protection, don't even go there. We just can't, that's our risk appetite, can't deal with that. At best, we'll put a web form up. Then great, that's your decision. If you say this thing just needs fundamental change, we haven't been able to shift this complex problem, we want to go to a total transformation, a business model, then go for it. So it's really about putting your eggs in the right basket and having the right strategic mindset when you're thinking about how you reform any government institution. So paper, just in case you haven't seen that before, we still do a lot of Paper online is our tongue-in-cheek approach to PDFs. These are the ones that fear me out more than anything. This is essentially government bit is run by Adobe. This is the one that pisses me off more than anything because I haven't had a printer for about a decade. And so if someone gives me a PDF, I literally don't know what to do with it. So I'd rather they just gave me a piece of paper, to be honest, because at least I don't have to find a printer. And we stop redistributing the cost of printing to our citizens. Then there's sort of some improvement. So it's often like a payment, which feels like a luxury sometimes that you can achieve a task, even if it's not an end-to-end achievement of something. But generally, you probably then have to follow it up with a phone call to say, I didn't get a confirmation of that payment on email. Did you get the payment, sort of thing? You've all had those experiences, but it's better than nothing. Then there's the end-to-end service transformation. People like DVLA down the road in Swansea and others who have led on this, which is you don't have to talk to a human, which is increasingly, I think, a lot of people's litmus test around driving license renewal or passport renewal or whatever it might be. Again, though, like, our criteria would not probably be the same as GDS's criteria. GDS's criteria is an online end-to-end service. Mine would be, and an organisation that is refashioned in line with that service and saved a hell of a lot of money under the surface rather than just papering over the cracks. And then you're at a sort of level 5 when you're saying, we want to do this fundamentally differently. Like, how do we flip the business model of this bit of government and just think about what it would be in a 21st century? I'll talk about Casserole a bit in a while, but SH24 is based in South East London. I think it was Southwark and Lambeth Health Trusts both decided that they would essentially get in the way of doing a proper digital startup. So they started a KIC, community interest company, and invested money in it to create essentially a social purpose digital startup to address sexual health testing. And they're now saying that it's a 50% cost saving on the NHS around sexual health testing, where essentially you register for it online, comes in an unmarked box so that your parents don't know what you're up to. You do the test and send it back, and then your health or ill health is beautifully visualized on their website, and you can actually do something about it, rather than walking into one of those clinics that has sexual health clinic written over the top in really prominent parts of the town. And so everyone deals with you really awkwardly. So like that's where they've basically said, like, how can we learn from others? So you might have seen the sort of DNA testing thing, the ancestry type stuff, like where like they've essentially just mimicked that, but for a pro-social purpose. And Casserole Club, as I'll come on to, is essentially us just ripping off the concepts behind any dating site, but using it to get people to meet and communities fed. Just to give you a couple of examples around sort of institutional reform from different angles. New South Wales in Australia is the population of London spread over the geography of Western Europe with one social care department, which is mind-blowing. Unsurprisingly, it doesn't really work, running a social care department at that kind of scale in that kind of way, where they literally can have like 30 families spread over 1,000 miles. And that leads to some of the worst child protection outcomes in the Western world in there, particularly as they have stats like 50% of all Aboriginal kids end up in care at some point in this day and age, given we're only 50 years since they used to be classified as fauna. I suppose that's a step forward, but it's pretty awful in terms of some of the outcomes. And so what their politicians did was invest $500 million in a thing called Safe Home for Life, which is a fundamental reboot of their child protection policy, practice and procedures and the technology underneath it. And that was really important because from the very beginning they were understanding of the fact that you really, a bit like our Venn diagram, a different version of that is that they understood that if you're not prototyping and testing changes in policy, practice and technology simultaneously, you're missing a trick. Something is locking something into a future that is not what it might be. So if you buy a fixed case management solution that was coded 15 years ago, that's essentially what your practice is going to have to do, because you have to sit down and do what the computer tells you to. And until you enter text and press save, it won't let you open the next screen. So that's how you work, right? So they understood they needed to invent some new technology for new practice. They needed to possibly legislate for new information sharing rules so that they could change policy and regulation around some of that stuff to liberate practice and to liberate technology to be more than it had been previously. And really interestingly, we worked with them to think about how procurement was going to determine an awful lot of their technology strategy, essentially. And so we invented a thing called Prototype to Procure with them, where the CIO and myself realized we had a 6-month window before the procurement had to happen. I tried to not have a procurement, but at least I had that design constraint set. I knew my expectations. It was like, let's try and break this as much as possible and make it the best goddamn procurement you've ever seen, which actually involves humans and their needs rather than robots and their needs. And so it actually started with this two-day workshop in the Qantas Innovation Centre near Sydney Airport, where, when have you ever seen government send out, and this was 5 years ago, send out a pencil sketch as the agenda, rather than one of those really boring Word documents with a logo and bullet point list, right? It was just a pencil sketch, and they were like, we think this is what we're going to be doing for 2 days, but it's a pencil sketch because we might rub it out and change it as we go, basically. And again, something I couldn't break was that they used their traditional language of intake and contact and all these very social work sort of policy and practice words, and I really didn't want them to think that way. It was much more about talking to families instead of initial contact or whatever it might be. But nevertheless, you work with those constraints. And what we did on day one was essentially we had practitioners and families working with us to really understand what is that experience like and how could we build it from scratch, essentially. And then overnight, both in Australia and also the usefulness of time zones, was sending some stuff up to England to be able to be built overnight and to be prototyped, so that by the time they came back on day 2 in the morning, there was live prototype technology for the families and practitioners to be able to play with, to say, bloody hell, that's exactly what I meant. And compare that 24-hour process. What the hell do you get done in 24 hours in government? You've probably done the introduction to your 50-page business case. Whereas they're going, I told you what I needed and what was wrong, and you've just put something in front of me and I can tell you what's good and bad about it. And then working through that, there was another 6-month process of taking it into the field, working out what policies needed to be changed, feeding into what were other work streams out of technology, like what do we need to get the politicians to pass in Parliament in order to make sure that this technology we're building will actually be allowed to be used. And so it was all kind of knitted together in that big way. Ultimately, I would say that we got 50% of the way towards where I wanted to. And really the main win of it was certain things like design principles that we got into the procurement. So things like the technology had to be as elegant as the prototypes that we'd built. The technology had to be open standards, it had to be cloud-based, it had to be essentially modern, usable technology. And of 300 suppliers who expressed an interest in supplying for them, only 9 were capable of actually submitting because the rest didn't meet those modern design principles. And so they actually ended up buying Salesforce, which is a sales CRM, and then hacking it into child protection because it was just about the only system that was anywhere near what they needed. My wish was that they built it. I'd wish that government had had the guts to actually get back into invention. For as long as my career, everybody has talked about buy, don't build. And it's just because of alliteration, because it's a simple trite phrase, but it's destructive of government. If you said to Deliveroo, buy, don't build, and they said, I'm sorry, there's no technology. We need to be a technology company in order to do the business we're trying to deliver. They would they would just laugh at you. Whereas we just think like a finance system that was built in a basement in Germany for the purposes of an Audi car company should just obviously work for local government in the UK, and buy, don't build. And it's no, there is some uniqueness, and we're just fearful of understanding that we're all technology and software organisations now. That's what makes the 21st century. And so it shouldn't be about seeing it as a cost centre and an overhead and a thing you just buy and plug in. It is a thing that has to be crafted like clay rather than something that is just chiselled from a big granite block. And so then West London heard about this, where they'd just been rated excellent in all children's services, and they rang me up and said, we'd heard about your work in Australia. We were the best in the UK, we want to be the best in the world at child protection and children's services. What was good and bad about the stuff you did in Australia? How can we go further? And I said, well, they never let us build it. And they said, all right then, let's do it. And so we've been working on this with them for 18 months. 3 councils, previously known as Triborough, until they Trexited recently, and now they're Byborough and Hammersmith. They have 30 systems is an understatement, as you would imagine, very disconnected, people running multiple millions off Excel spreadsheets, like the same story you see in most organisations and most of government. Massive challenges, but the good thing was there was a lot to run at, which is always nice. There was a culture by which they said, technology is holding back our policy and practice. We can be truly excellent, but the technology says no. So just fill your boots and go for it, basically, because we want to catch up. And they were starting to understand that sort of Venn diagram earlier. And they felt like, 60% plus of time being around data input just wasn't where they wanted to be. So again, using the outcomes from Australia with their blessing, the Australian project was called Child Story. With their blessing, it became Family Story in West London. They, without any extra costs, sort of through just collaboration and sharing, took all of the prototypes, all of design research from Australia, and basically used it to through hypothesis test whether that works in West London. And a load of it did, a load of it didn't. Built more, changed it, which I think is a real thing around collaboration in government. Built a whole new experience, and importantly came at it from an experience level. Like, how should this feel? What should this, from a user and practitioner perspective, how do they want this to feel? How should it work? Rather than business process mapping, which is the thing you get onto afterwards, which is head stuff. You start with heart stuff, which is what should this experience be? And then it's how do you make it happen? And then it's what technology do we need to hardwire it all together? And so a whole bunch of prototypes and products are being built right now, pretty much literally right now, in order to put in front of practitioners, starting with things like recording in the field, so voice-to-text transcription, so that when they get back to their desks, it may be a slightly garbled bunch of text, but it's certainly better than doing it from scratch. You're more editing rather than typing up your long notes. It saves people multiple hours in their week. You suddenly don't have, the theory will be, the business case is predicated on, you don't have these massive vacancy rates in social care because you don't need so many people if they're only spending 30% of time on admin instead of 70% of time. And also it's really good for recruitment and retention because in theory people will get drawn towards places where they can do their job rather than feeding the beast of a horrible system. So we're playing with all of that right now. Big savings, big results, all predicated, some big loose promises, rather than getting trapped in anything too tight. But the interesting thing is working out who in the system can help you make this change happen as well. So we've got this judge called Judge Aitken, who is like the most amazing ally, who is, everybody is always, everyone's like, legislatively, we have to write this stuff down. And then you kind of turn to the judge and go, really? And they go, no, God, I hate receiving that stuff. I just need a summary that tells me what the hell I should do when the family comes in front of me. We're like, okay, you happy now? And they're like, but the law, and I'm like, the law just said it's okay. So it's really interesting how you use different points of leverage within the system to make sure that you can get change to happen as well, including chief social worker backing us and a range of other things. So it's got a while to run that. It'll be out in the field being trialled by the end of the year. And then after that, it's a matter of big decisions that need to be made, basically. Are we talking about a digital wrapper around their existing systems to just do the lipstick bit, which does bring big benefits? It should liberate their practice, but it still has the embedded cost of some of those systems and other things. Or are they going to go for it? Are they going to invest multiple millions in building a SH24 style child protection technology startup that can actually act as a challenger to the market, which is, a very turgid 3-system market because it's a relatively small market, where they can actually be a confident bit of government and say, we need to invent the future, we don't need to be a slave to the past. I'll skip that. That's crazy stuff in UAE. UAE is like, if you ever get a chance to work in the United Arab Emirates, do it, just as an experience. Their pitch to us was, we want 7-star public services, which is like beyond first world problems, really. I was like, have you got, they were like, yeah, we've got a 7-star hotel. I was like, can I stay in it so I know what 7-star feels like? It's pretty hard to design 7-star services if I don't know what it feels like. That didn't work. So that's only for royalty. But it was really interesting. Again, this thing about different things in different contexts. Like the interesting thing there was like they jumped straight. It was almost a lesson in like modesty. When like they are on an individual level, the people we worked with are beautiful, lovely, modest people. On a country level, like they're trying to challenge Elon Musk on a mission to Mars stuff. Like they're like out there. They were the first place with the drone extreme games. They were like they've got everything first, right? And so the problem was they wanted to jump to, we can do the biggest possible transformation of government without having done any of the groundwork to bring people along to help them understand stuff. So they thought if we spent a week a month for 6 months there, by the end of it you would have a seamless end-to-end finding a job, having a baby, getting married, service provision, like with institutional reform, a digital front end, a set cost savings. And we were like, I thought we were doing a learning and development process for you so that your people could then, like, wasn't this a sandpit rather than in live? And like, it was a sandpit until about month 4. By month 5, they were like, Sheikh Mohammed wants to come and see it all and he expects it to be live next month. And you're like, oh my God, we're in trouble. So it was an interesting one, but really useful on reflection that they realized that they would, it was as much as anything, a lot of this work is around self-awareness. I think a lot of our work and a lot of strategy work and design work in government is helping people understand where they actually are, rather than where they think they are, so that they can actually move forward. If you're going from a point of delusion to a point of no hope, then like you're going nowhere, right? If you're going from a point of self-awareness to something feasible, at least you've moved forward, right? And so that's where I think a lot of this stuff needs to go from. So I think the last example I'm going to give is the work that I'm doing right now in Homes England, which, as the name suggests, is responsible for enabling the build of 300,000 new homes in England, not including London, every year for the next 10 years. So we need to build 3 million homes in a decade just to catch up with what the market has not built in the last 35 years or whatever it is. And then that number might come down a little bit, but there's quite a lot of demand in a world of Brexit where the people to build it might not be in the country anymore and other things, but we'll deal with that when we get to it. But what we're doing there is it's an organisation of 700 people, which is quite nice because I'm used to working with organisations that are at least 10 times bigger than that. So it feels kind of relatively human scale, believe it or not. We are doubling in size in the next 12 months to 1,500 people, recruiting over 50 people a month right now. So that's interesting because I, in my entire career, have only worked in austerity, and so don't actually know whether I have a strategic mindset capable of organisational development and growth. So I'm trying to work out what that looks like. Fortunately, I've built a company, so I have some frame of reference, but it's still interesting when I'm so used to like, oh, I can save you some money, and they're like, that's not the point of this endeavour, what are you doing? We're just trying to build more homes, whatever the money takes, go for it. But what it means is that we can use it as a petri dish. I've actually gone in 3 days a week as Chief Digital Officer and taken a whole load of FutureGovers with me in order to try and like do a handbrake turn on the way that the digital team is designing and delivering the organisation, to actually give like a massive new momentum to that in a way that when you're 3-4 people advising, coding, prototyping, you know, you're just a pinprick on that system. Whereas we're actually got the legitimacy to say we want the organisation to look like this, and in order to do that we have to spend this money on these things or build these things or build in this talent or build these skills. Which is really exciting, which means it is like a petri dish for what could a 21st century government agency really look and feel like. So yeah, that's the task. It's really bloody hard because the only time we've ever done that is when councils were building them about 40 years ago. So it is to try and achieve something that has never been achieved in Britain before, which is to just have predominantly the private sector and some social housing providers to build 300,000 new homes a year. But what that means is that the way I see myself is more chief organisation designer rather than chief design digital officer. I forgot my own job title. In the sense that if you use digital, people think noun, they think department, they think website. Like really what this is about is what is our operating model, what's our business model in order to become essentially what is a platform organisation, right? If you think about what we are, we're really good on land data, like where's available land. We've got a lot of money to sort of grease the wheels of capitalism and try and persuade people to build a lot more houses a lot more quickly. Like that's a matchmaking service. It's a marketplace. It's a digital business inherently as a business model. And like the only way that we can truly get anywhere near these figures is to act like a scaled digital business, not like a triangular bureaucracy that just delivers government in a traditional way, because we're a pinprick on the housing market. Whereas if we are a platform for the housing market, we are scalable and we have half a chance of achieving this outcome. So at the moment we're rapidly rolling through basically discovery of everything. Like everything is broken. We're running 20-year-old technology that's all built in-house. I would love an off-the-shelf solution, but everything, even the sort of German finance system I took the piss out of earlier, that would be heaven compared to the kind of stuff I'm dealing with. I haven't been in a place that's coded its own finance system before. So we're really trying to work out what is everything that is happening. Where is the most impact on the housing market happening within the organisation? How do we double down on that? How do we make that truly digital? And how do we stop doing a load of things that just aren't working? So that means we have to be digital rather than just do digital. And it starts with even the smallest things. Like, so as a digital team, I'm trying to get us to change our culture to work in the open, to try and prioritise effectively, to use tools like Trello so that the organisation can actually see what we're working on, which is one of the big gripes, which is we don't know who gets their requests agreed. We don't know why you're spending your money on what you're spending your money on. So I'm like, all right, then sod it. I'll just open it all up and we can all just have a Hunger Games argument about what goes when, and actually start to act much more collaboratively and communicate much better. We're putting in timesheeting, which, as you can imagine, works has a mixed reviews in government, but it isn't about holding people to account per se. It is more about saying to the organisation, if you want your aspiration to be set here, it'll take this many days per year to do that. And in my team, I only have this many days. So either you give us more people and more days to change this organisation even quicker, or we have to prioritise what we're doing based around the resources we actually have, because most organisations don't have that transparency and visibility of capacity to deliver, and therefore projects are always red, always overspent, because all expectations are misset from the beginning because you don't actually know whether it's feasible. You just do finger in the air stuff. Slack is probably the most transformative tool in an organisation if you get it right, and that's starting to change things. But most importantly, I think, and I try to stay away from structural solutions generally, but I've realised that when you're trying to when you're trying to get to the future, you kind of have to start to mimic the future and then start to work towards it. But what that has meant is flipping the order of play in terms of how we run the organisation. So instead of everything being baked into a triangular hierarchy in terms of how everything works, it's actually saying multidisciplinary teams delivering on projects, wherever people come from in the organisation, is what success looks like. We're a delivery organisation. Then it's about how do we look after our professions? How do we nurture designers, developers, planners? And then eventually it's like, okay, fine. We have to have a hierarchy. Everyone needs one-to-ones. You can have some management, but like it's in that order. And you really only get reward and managerial success if you're doing number one and number two really well, rather than the other way around, which is I've been sat here for 20 years, so I'm at the top of the tree. I don't have to evidence delivery or any kind of professional development, which is too much of what happens. So multidisciplinary teams to deliver services, learning from people like Spotify and others around how we value their professional networks and ways of working, and simplifying my structure to something very straightforward, which is managing delivery and doing delivery, basically, which is fairly straightforward. And then we drew a structure chart that looks like something out of HBR rather than out of a government website around organograms. But ultimately, it's about trying to give an expression of togetherness, oneness and delivery, basically, which is what it's all about. And so this is essentially one massive organisational experiment, which you can watch live on the internet as we blog it. And I'm demanding that we're not going to do the government, everything is perfect and look what we've done and isn't this brilliant type blogging. It will be, oh God, that was a really bad thing we did this week, because that's much more interesting to people. And then the last one's around Casserole Club. This has ended up being an experiment. We did try to start a business around replacing Meals on Wheels, which essentially says who's got a spare plate at dinner, who wants a plate at dinner, matchmaking service online like Match.com or anything else. Internet does that stuff really well. We've made it work in various places around the world. We built it from the bottom up in Surrey, and then rolled it out into very different places. We went from like leafy Surrey straight into Tower Hamlets, which are literally the opposite end of any demographic analysis you will ever do of Britain. And it seemed to work in both those places, and then we started scaling it. We really prototyped. So we started with 100 houses and a pen and paper and an intern, and people leaving cakes on doorsteps saying, please sign up to Casserole Club, to try and show a shift in public sector mindset. This isn't about bus stop posters about being a good person or whatever else, like volunteer, which is a word we've never used, because that only gets you to the usual suspects. If you're trying to get to everybody, it has to feel like a modern service, which is why would you not do this? And now we have people in Australia and the UK smiling a lot, eating dinner out of Tupperware boxes. Having said all of that, we are probably going to close it this year, because it has ended up being more of an experiment over 5 years than a thing that we have managed to graft onto government or into community groups, charities or other places. What we're finding is that government doesn't change from being a bureaucracy to a community organisation. Shock horror. It's set up to run services really efficiently and effectively and reliably, not to be Obama's community organisers, so they don't shift. The people who do community organising have got very fixed views about how to do community organising, and digital is terrifying to people who carry around feature phones rather than smartphones, which is fair enough. And really what is in the missing middle for some of this stuff, which I believe will emerge at some point, is sort of some sort of social VC scaled approach to how we invent from the bottom up, from scratch, digital public services that are different to institutional reform. I just don't think we're there yet. People like Nesta are about the only place that you can actually look for that stuff. In Australia, it's even harder. They don't have a thing like that. They just don't really have social investment. And I think that's a long way to go. Last thing's lessons learned. Empathy's hard, empathy's everything. I'm an ex-policy wonk. I hated talking to people. And it really takes you time to get used to that stuff as a bureaucrat. I have a lot of sympathy for people who find research and human contact difficult. If it isn't you, you need to find people who are good at it and just value it. Collaboration across the sector. We did some work with the GLA around a thing called London Office of Technology and Innovation, which is starting to connect the 33 boroughs to share technologies, share design research, share philosophy around this stuff. Feels like Wales should be doing a hell of a lot more on that and should be the vanguard of collaboration. Design doing, not design thinking. Design thinking is an insidious and awful phrase because it just allows you to be a policy wonk who still sits at your desk and strokes your chin and says, I'm a design thinker. And you invent Peter Persona, who isn't a real person. They're just Peter Persona. And you say, let me think about Peter Persona. I'm going to write a policy that, okay, that's not design, right? That's make-believe. Design is the act of going and talking to people and making stuff and testing stuff. And we have to not confuse those two things. I'm so bored of having the conversation around technology with people, but I really believe we're only at the very beginning of persuading leadership that it is important and it is going somewhere. After 10 years, I think we've at last broken the seal on that stuff, and that people will at least have that conversation with you to say it might be important, but it's a very long journey. Policy and practice needs to be agile, we talked about that, and also none of this stuff fixes the underlying rules of you need strategies and you need good leaders. Just because you've gone and done some service design course or learned how to download an app from the App Store does not mean you are suddenly going to win at this stuff. Like if we just transcend the sort of basics of running an organisation and public services and end up in design and digital douchebag land, then we're in trouble, to be honest. We need to get serious about this. I am so fed up of bits of government talking about how this stuff matters and then them going and commissioning PwC or any other nonsense big company that in itself is a 20th century organisation that can't possibly teach government how to be 21st century because they themselves can't get out of the 20th century. We have to stop this cognitive dissonance between wanting this stuff and then procuring the wrong people. Like, there is really no other way to do it other than to find people who will embed themselves and be true partners. I see it in Homes England more than anywhere else right now, because ultimately you have to hand the keys of the car back to the people who are going to run this for 10 or 20 years. Nobody needs the shiny suits coming in and telling them things that they've read on a website somewhere. And we just have to be disruptive. Like, there is I'm pretty depressed at the moment about how undisruptive a lot of digital government is. Like, it has the if you look at like the the way that social media disrupted the Middle East, right? Like, that was like some sort of nadir of like social action. And then over here, we're putting web forms over broken organizations, and you're just like, seriously? Like, anyone up for like rebalancing this power thing and like actually getting people involved in government and doing things fundamentally differently? Or are we just gonna like paper over this with some pixels and hope everything gets better? Because it ain't. It's gonna collapse before it gets better. So we really have to think about like, where is power? What do we do about it? How do we redistribute it? Even if you don't want to redistribute it, at least deliberately think about it and use technology to reinforce your power base like Trump is. Like, whatever you say about him, he's doing it deliberately and strategically. I quite like people who want to give some citizens some power back to be as deliberate and active in their use of technology in order to be able to achieve that. Otherwise, he'll win. And that's it. Thanks very much.